Few things capture the imagination the way Heroes do. Stories of people using their special talents, gifts, and abilities to save the rest of us against all odds. The battles they have to fight their hearts out to win, the personal obstacles they have to struggle to overcome. Heroes are as inspiring as they are fun, and if you take the concept far enough, they become the perfect vehicle to explore some weighty questions about ourselves and the world we live in. Namely, is it okay for heroes to do what they do? Is having them out there taking the law into their own hands with no training or oversight actually safe? Can individuals with this much power be trusted to keep themselves in line when their actions could just as easily do harm? And more importantly, does asking these sorts of questions conflict with the point of Heroes, imposing real-world concerns onto a fantasy that was never meant to include them? These are questions that can be hard to answer, if they even have a right answer. Fortunately, we get to see these concepts explored from two drastically different perspectives, by My Hero Academia and Marvel's Civil War. In both the movie and the comic, Civil War was about the government wanting to impose strict regulations on the actions of superheroes, after a disaster that caused the death of a lot of innocent people. The heroes themselves were split on the decision, with everyone taking a side and each faction gaining a figurehead. Iron Man's career is littered with bad people using his technology for mass murder, so he saw the need for regulation and became the face of the pro-registration side. While Captain America values his country's ideals about freedom and liberty far more than loyalty to the government, so he became the leader of the anti-registration side. Captain America's position is best summed up by this quote from the movie version of Civil War. "If we sign this, we surrender our right to choose. What if this panel sends us somewhere we don't think we should go? What if there's somewhere we need to go and they don't let us? We may not be perfect, but the safest hands are still our own." He fully believes that if the government starts to regulate superheroes, they'll lose the autonomy that makes them so effective. And worse, they'll be barred from intervening in situations where they could save lives. But it's weighed against the possibility that an Avenger could build a robot that lifts a densely populated city into orbit, or that a group of D-list heroes could provoke a villain into blowing up a school. It's a question of what's more important, safety or liberty? Do you trust the individual or the government? Does opposing regulation mean willfully putting the public at risk? These are very good, very interesting questions to inject into a world full of superpowered people who have to coexist with normal people. Unfortunately, it doesn't end up being that difficult of a question. Marvel likes to play fast and loose with consequences. You know, it's generally accepted that even though the Hulk has spent decades going on destructive rampages, he's somehow never killed anyone, unless the story specifically calls for it. Because the implication of looking at the Hulk's actions from a more realistic point of view would shatter a lot of what people go to Hulk stories for. By bringing realism into it, harm is done to the fantasy of superheroes. That's an element the creators and readers don't want to lose, so everyone ends up siding with Captain America, even though regulation is the thing we'd actually want in real life. It's also why the success of the Superhero Registration Act is ultimately short-lived, and why you put a villain like Norman Osborn in charge of it. Because it's meant to fail, so classic idealism can come flooding back in like rays of sunlight after a rainstorm. You heard me right, by the way. Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, was appointed by the United States government to be in charge of regulating superheroes. Putting him in charge, making him the face of the Registration Act, made it a tale about putting too much power in the wrong hands. It gave Marvel an easy out, because, of course, Osborn would deputize teams of government-sanctioned supervillains, and of course, he would round up anti-registration heroes into a black site prison without officially charging them with anything. Just like that, everything that made Civil War and the Registration Act interesting had been thrown away, despite all the questions asked and promises made up to that point. The worst part is, for a little while there, it seemed like Marvel was going to follow through and deliver on some of the potential of this premise. we were starting to see a change outside of the superhero community. Most citizens of the Marvel Universe liked superheroes being held accountable for their actions, and collateral damage being treated far more seriously. Young heroes just coming into their powers were being drafted into the Avengers Initiative, where seasoned heroes like War Machine, Tigra, and a guy named Gauntlet, who I think Blizzard paid very close attention to, gave these kids important help and guidance in the proper ways to use their powers. A lot of people still had a big problem with children being made to register with a government database and then attend a mandatory superhero boot camp, but it wasn't stopping those kids from learning what they needed in order to go out into the world and help people. A lot like the students of UA Academy in the world of My Hero Academia. Unlike the Marvel Universe, the world of My Hero Academia was introduced to the concept of superpowers through violence and chaos. People misused and abused their special quirks left and right, villains rose up before heroes. All of the things that the government of the Marvel Universe was afraid could happen there did happen here. Only it happened right at the start of the superpowered age. It was all the government could do just to reestablish order, and really the entire reason this world has heroes is to serve as examples of why everyone should go along with the rules governing the use of special powers. The government needed to make sure that people wouldn't use their powers as weapons, so it strictly regulated the use of those powers, but offered official channels to go through in order to gain the ability to use superpowers openly. By earning your license, you become a pro-hero and can operate freely as long as you abide by the rules. The whole process led to a dramatic decrease in crime and injuries caused by people with powers, and the general public gained an ever-growing appreciation and admiration for those individuals willing to go through all the trouble to become pro-heroes. Much like in the Marvel Universe, these pro-heroes are among the only people that an average citizen will ever see using powers in public, and they're always using them for something that's explicitly for the public good, reinforcing the idea that the system works. It creates an environment where little kids like Deku here, who idolize heroes for all the good they do, grow up wanting to go through the system and become licensed themselves. To them, the bureaucracy is just another part of your origin story. What's interesting about Deku is that the thing he's chasing in trying to become a hero is the same set of ideals that Captain America fought to protect in Civil War, and is having trouble because of the political climate he's coming up in. We see this in the aftermath of the battle with Stain, when even though Deku's actions saved countless lives by taking a super-powered serial killer off the streets, he was still going to face some harsh punishments for acting outside of the rules that heroes are required by law to follow. He acted to save lives, but because he wasn't licensed, could have faced jail time if deals weren't made behind closed doors. And yet, he still fights his absolute hardest for his ideals. Not by raging against the unjust nature of society, but rather by striving to be an example to those around him. Deku spent his entire young life looking up to heroes who give everything of themselves to protect people from harm, and convince them that everything will be okay. He wants to grow up to be like them, to be a symbol of hope for anyone who needs it. And it does not matter to him what rules he has to follow, what forms he has to fill out, or what qualifications he has to meet in order to do it. Deku knows what a hero can mean to people, because he knows what they've always meant to him. So he plays ball, works within the system, and proves to everyone around him just what someone who believes as hard as he does in the superhero ideal can do. Deku is proof that Captain America's ideals can survive and be a guiding light for heroes, even in an environment where those heroes are strictly regulated. Putting those kinds of limitations on the actions of your heroes might seem like a burden, and may even take away from the fantasy of superheroes. But this kind of complexity is the breeding ground for thought-provoking stories and intensely personal character arcs. Like Uraraka, who desperately wants to get her license so she can use her gravity powers in place of the large, expensive machinery used by her parents' failing construction company, motivated by a desire to give something meaningful back to the two people who have always been there for her and given her everything. Because of the regulations that require her to be licensed, Uraraka has a challenge to overcome before she can reach her goal, and has to go on a long, difficult road of self-improvement before she can achieve it. She will be a better and more rounded person by the time she's able to finally stand tall and help her parents, and none of that would have happened without the government stepping in. If this were the Marvel Universe, she could have just woke up one day and decided to help, and that would have been it. A footnote in her day-to-day routine instead of a character-defining journey. But none of that means the show takes a clear-cut stance on whether the system is good or bad. Most of the villains are motivated by a dissatisfaction with this particular status quo and what society's relationship with heroes is. By licensing pro-heroes and then celebrating them, society creates an ever-growing group that feels disenfranchised. A group that's had it with a society that says they can't display their gifts openly. That so-called heroes symbolizing systemic hypocrisy aren't better than anyone. That serial killer I mentioned earlier, Stain, his entire motivation is that he believes in the same ideals as Deku and Captain America. He believes that regulating heroes to the point that it's just another career path undermines the core of why heroes are important. So he lashes out violently, mowing down pro-heroes to try and prove to society that they've neutered the very concept of what an effective hero is. Stain, all by himself, is a multifaceted exploration of the entire Civil War story, and he's just one small piece of this world. The biggest difference between the Marvel Universe and the world of My Hero Academia is that Marvel started in a place of fantastical escapism, and slowly introduced a sense of cynicism, which threw a lot of people off and seemed to contradict what Marvel had been about all along, limiting how far they're really willing to take certain topics. While My Hero Academia's world began by asking those tough questions and built out from there. Even though they both touched on the same ideas, having such different foundations led Marvel and Hiroaka to treat those ideas totally differently. Civil War wanted to take the black and white world of the Marvel Universe and present it as something gray without really committing to what that means. And because the intent was never to effect lasting change, the conflict was kept to a simple us versus them scenario, where you picked your team and rooted for them to win. And because of what the conflict was and how it was presented, that meant rooting for the underdog fighting not to be oppressed. My Hero Academia, however, decided to go all in. They fully committed to making this the permanent state of their world, and started to explore every question that goes along with it. And those answers become more meaningful when you realize that this status quo isn't going away. This is the world, these are the rules, and how you deal with them is where your stories and character arcs come from. So when all's said and done, it turns out there was never actually anything wrong with the Superhero Registration Act. The Marvel Universe was just built to reject it. I want to thank the guys over at Earth's Mightiest Podcast for filling in the gaps of my post-Civil War knowledge. They've spent years reading and watching everything even tangentially related to the Avengers and podcasting about it, and their love of the material really shows through in every episode. Do yourselves a favor and go pay a visit to earthsmightiestpodcast.com, where you'll always find Corwin, Viet, and Alex talking about their favorite thing. There's a link in the description of this video, be sure to follow it. Or search Earth's Mightiest Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you think I'm picking on Marvel, don't worry, I think Hiroaka does DC better too. Watch my video about how anime understands Superman better than DC and Warner Brothers to see why. Thank you all for watching, I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you again soon.